Welcome back to the Carlisle's Chesapeake Show. We have as our guest Suzanne Dorsey, who is the Executive Director of the Harry Hughes Ctr for Agro-Ecology.
That's right. Perfect.
Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you here. Tell us about yourself first, how you became the Executive Director and what your background is.
Sure. Well, I am a returnee to Maryland, so I've been gone for about 25 years, but I grew up here in the state of Maryland, and I'm a very proud Maryland resident. I am interested in conservation, and I'm very interested in helping our state and our nation do better in terms of managing our clean water, our land, and our air. So the Harry R. Hughes Ctr for Agroecology is working in an area that is just pivotal right now in conservation. They work at the combination of prosperous farms and forestry and clean air and water, particularly the Chesapeake Bay.
So explain agroecology, please.
So agroecology acknowledges the fact that our farmers and our foresters are managing ecosystems in much the same way that a conservationist might manage a coral reef, the Chesapeake Bay, or a forest ecosystem.
And how would I, as a farmer, manage my land?
So your land, that you're managing it to produce crops, but there's still a complex ecosystem in the soil. There are adjacent ecosystems. If you have a farm along the Chesapeake Bay, you'll have nutrient exchange both ways to the Chesapeake Bay and from the Chesapeake Bay to your fields. So how do you manage to produce crops in a way that stewards our land and makes sure that our air and our water are clean?
I hadn't thought, you always think of that part of that equation, what am I doing that would affect the Chesapeake Bay, but I hadn't thought about the Chesapeake Bay affecting my land.
Sure. So the most obvious way to me is when I drive along the highway and I see flocks of seagulls or Canada geese sitting on our fields. They are providing nutrient input to our fields, and that nutrient is derived from an aquatic environment. So although we really focus in conservation, and we should, on the facts that our farms can release nutrients to our waterways, our groundwater and our tributaries in our bay, there's an exchange that goes the other direction as well. In fact, blowing water, and especially salty water, can be beneficial in that it can add trace nutrients to our fields that are important. Sometimes it can add too much of those nutrients and be detrimental in terms of salt, for instance.
So at the Hughes Ctr, what actually goes on there?
So the Hughes Ctr is located at the Y Research and Education Center in Queenstown, Maryland. We are not a physical center. We have 3 full-time staff, and we work to try to provide leadership to our community in the state of Maryland to ensure that our working lands, and working lands means forests and farms that produce things that we as a society need. And we at the Hughes Ctr try to help forests and farms be profitable while stewarding our environment, particularly our Chesapeake Bay environment.
So you have a dual purpose in that it's farms and forestry, and I was really interested to learn that forestry is the second largest employer on the Eastern Shore.
Forestry is a very important industry on the Eastern Shore, particularly the lower Eastern Shore, where trees are harvested sustainably in a manner that is acceptable in terms of a conservation standpoint to produce bedding for our poultry industry, but also we export bedding all the way across the Northeast up to the Great Lakes region.
What do you mean by bedding?
So wood shavings that you might use if you have an animal or horse, if you have a child who has a rabbit, the wood shavings that would make up their bedding, a lot of that comes from right here on the Eastern Shore.
So you wouldn't necessarily have to have old growth forest to create that bedding.
And in general, we don't harvest old growth forest. There's very little old growth forest in Maryland or really anywhere. So that's an environment that you might want to preserve, which means that you do little. You make sure that there aren't invasive insects or plants that are doing harm to that. but you're not necessarily doing cutting, except for in rare cases.
Dorchester County is a hot spot these days. Tom Horton and David Harp have put together a brilliant film about what's happening with sea level rise there. And one of the focuses of your center is to look at how the sea level rise impacts the land.
That's right.
Could you talk about that, please?
Sure. So I have a fair bit of experience working in coastal issues, particularly around coastal resiliency, and that's the idea of how our coastal land habitats, excuse me, are affected by things like sea level rise. And sea level rise is when the sea level comes up from the side. We call that inundation. But also what people don't see is that salt water is pushing on our groundwater. So underneath the land, the salt water is coming into our groundwater. And that's a phenomenon called saltwater intrusion. It affects the quality of our freshwater resource on our coastal environments. So we are very interested in understanding how saltwater intrusion is impacting our agricultural and our forestry working lands on the eastern shore of Maryland. What we know is that when salt water comes into the groundwater, it changes the chemistry around nutrients in the top layers of soil. And it can change the way those nutrients flow or don't flow into the bays and our tributaries. If we're not ready for that, the rules that we have governing nutrients on farms today won't be relevant or could have a negative impact in the future. So we really want to understand that phenomena. Furthermore, if we want to continue to live here, we need to make sure that we have plentiful, fresh, high quality fresh water.
So much has to do with chemistry. I mean, there are so many people on the Eastern Shore and Western Shore who are biologists.
That's right. That's right.
But chemistry seems to be so important as well.
Chemistry is really important, and these nutrients become either mobile, they move easily, or they're bound up depending on the chemistry of the soil. The more complex your soil, the better that soil holds in the nutrients. So by complexity, we mean that it has a high biodiversity. It's got a lot of insects, it's got a lot of microorganisms, a lot of bacteria, a lot of fungi. All of those things come together, make the soil sticky, and that keeps the nutrients in place, but it allows it to be taken up by plants. So farmers really work towards soil fertility. They know that if they can have fertile soil, and they do that by making sure that the organisms that live within that soil are healthy and vibrant and diverse, their crops will grow better.
Wow. Tell us about Connect the Dots.
So Connect the Dots comes from my introduction here on the shore. As I went around and spoke to many of our farming community and our forest community, they talked about pressures on them. And I'll give you an example, one that I had never thought of. They talked about the concept of no antibiotics in our food. And I always thought that was a good thing. I understood that some growers had used antibiotics to increase the growth trajectory of animals. And that use of antibiotics might have negative impacts on our availability of antibiotics to treat diseases. So there was a big move across the nation and across the world to keep antibiotics out of our food stream. That makes sense given that problem that they were trying to solve. Now what happens if a calf gets sick? Are we not allowed to treat a sick animal with antibiotics? Is that what we meant? Most of us on the consumer side, that's not what we meant.
Oh.
We want that calf to be treated. We have concerns about residual antibiotics in our food,
Right.
and that's a really important concern that we should address. But if you could treat a calf and have no residual antibiotics years later or a year later when that calf turns into food, then maybe we need to rethink this concept of no antibiotics. Maybe that's not what we as consumers really meant. So Connect the Dots is addressing the idea that we as consumers need to be a little bit more sophisticated in the questions we ask around agriculture. Most of us are now 2, 3, 4, 5 generations off of the farm.
Right.
And our understanding of how farming works is challenged.
Yeah.
A lot of Americans today think that farming today is much more harmful to the environment than it was 50 years ago. And that's just not true. Farmers today are sophisticated in how they work the land. They're entrepreneurs in trying to be innovative in solving problems. A lot of these farmers have been on the land, in Maryland especially, for generations. They care deeply about their land. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some bad apples out there, but the majority of farmers are doing their best to make sure that their land and the water around, especially in the Chesapeake Bay, is safe for the future. And as consumers, we need to make sure that we're helping them achieve those goals and maybe not standing in their way a little bit. So Connect the Dots is a campaign the Hughes Ctr is embarking on to help educate Agri-IQ. We want
like
our
that.
citizens to know a little bit more, to be better informed and make decisions that honor their values and their priorities, but don't change food production in a manner that might not be
Right.
what they're looking for.
Public sentiment could sway things one way when it's not really appropriate for them,
That's
for
right.
it to be swayed.
That's right.
For instance, this is, I know, a hot topic, but chickens is huge, especially here on the shore.
That's right. Chickens is fascinating to me. So
is
I have
fascinating.
learned so much about chickens on the shore. And I have to tell you, there's a concept as a conservationist, and my background is in conservation. There's a concept about living within your means. I'll say it that way. From an environmental standpoint, if we keep using up the resources of this earth, let's say we keep harvesting fossil fuels, at some point we will run out. We know that. The same could be said for certain rare minerals. If we keep all of our smartphones and we use up all of our rare minerals, then what? So we can run out of things. We know that South Africa has run out of fresh water, for instance. We need to make sure that we are living within our means, and our means from an ecological standpoint. Well, a solution to a challenge that we have in the developed world is we're consumer based. Our economies depend on us buying and throwing away, and buying and throwing away, and buying and throwing away. That's not living within our means. We'll run out if we keep doing that. So one of the principles that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has put forward is the concept of the circular economy. The idea that we shouldn't buy and throw away, that we should buy and reuse and reuse and reuse, and that any product that we purchase should circulate through our economy 3, 4, 5 times. Think of thrift stores.
I know. I was
Antique
thinking
stores,
I was just
right?
thinking the same
Right?
thing.
That's a circular economy. Well, one of my colleagues, Josh Bollinger, pointed out to me, Suzanne, isn't the chicken, the poultry industry on the shore, isn't that kind of what you were talking about with the circular economy? And I asked Josh, what do you mean by that? And he said, look, if the manure from chickens is put back on our fields in a way that meets all of our nutrient standards, and it's used to regrow the food for the next generation of chickens, isn't that going through our economy multiple times? And I said, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Is it a perfect system? No. Do we have a lot to learn about how to manage that and optimize our nutrients? Sure we do. But in general, that is a circular economy. That's a very efficient way, not just from a business or a profit standpoint, but from a resource perspective, an environmental perspective, of making sure that we're reusing those nutrients constantly.
That's very nice, Suzanne. It's a great way to paint our landscape.
Yeah, it's different than the way a lot of people think about that.
Well, we look forward to hearing more about the Hughes Ctr and your work and Connect the Dots.
Great. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
And we appreciate your watching our show, Carlisle's Chesapeake, and look forward to seeing you again.